Okay. We're in for a treat tonight. I got a lot to cover. I got 3 times as much material as I've had in the last 2 nights. So you got 3 sermons in 1 night. You guys are in for a treat. So first thing I want to do is I want to review real quick kind of where we've been for those of you who may have missed 1 or 2 nights. So basically the last couple of nights I've focused on some lies that Satan's been telling. First he started in heaven. Okay. He was able to fool 1/3 of the angels. He was kicked out of heaven. He came to earth. He was able to fool Adam and Eve. As a result, basically, we all are born defective. We don't work exactly like we should be. And so this is why we struggle with sin. But at the heart of these lies, and I want to make this clear tonight because it's got a lot of impact on what I'm going to say. At the heart of these lies, Satan claims one thing every time. He says God's laws are arbitrary. He says they're just a set of rules that he picked to suit himself, and they could be changed anytime. And ironically, this is exactly the case for Satan. He was jealous, right? Satan was jealous that he didn't have something that another angel had, or what he thought was an angel, I suppose. But he never actually cared about the fact that he was actually born with favor as well. You see, when he was created, he was given gifts that other angels didn't have. Those weren't the things he was worried about. He was only worried about what he didn't have, right? And so, if that sounds familiar to you, right? If you know those people that are never happy, they could have the world, but they're always focused on what somebody else has rather than all of the things they have. And this is Satan's basis for rebellion. And so what are the implications of this lie? What's the implication of this lie? I want to get you guys in this frame of mind up front because I'm going to be pounding on this all night, is when Satan accuses God of making laws up arbitrarily, when he says he just picked that because it works out good for him, right? What he's really saying is, okay, all of those things that God put in place could be changed at any time, and also all of the bad things that happen to you when you don't follow his path are really things he's doing to you. He's doing bad things to you, is what the implication is. Any consequence we face as a result of breaking these laws are due to the actions of God. That's something that follows. If you believe that God picks rules arbitrarily, you also have to believe he enforces them with force. And so think of all the things you've been taught about what happens to sinners, right? What are those things, right? You will face the judge. You will burn in hell. Right? Those are all things that Satan wants you to believe God is doing to you. And if you believe that God can do those things, then it's hard to believe that God is good. And that's exactly where he wants us to be. Right? He wants us to believe that God is purposely inflicting punishment on us. And it doesn't make God sound very good. Cast him in a poor light. This is Satan's aim. And he's been very successful at this, right? Because we know that many churches, Christian churches, teach some form of this, right? You could look up old sermons, fire and brimstone sermons, anytime, right? People are trying to, pastors will scare you to God, right? It doesn't work. That's Satan's tactic. And many non-believers take this view, and they look at it and they say, you know what, that doesn't sound right. That's a little fishy to me. Why would this God that you claim is loving torture me? Right? And it leads them, and in my opinion, this is probably not a bad thing for them, but it leads them to believe that such a God does not exist, because indeed that God does not exist. Right? And he's not deserving of worship if he did exist. And so my aim for tonight, just to set you guys up, is I want to establish that these are in fact lies. I want to discuss the consequences, as we just framed, of believing those lies. If we believe that God is as Satan presents him, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for the universe? And I'm going to tell you that even if you believe in God and you believe he's benevolent, but you haven't gotten over these lies, if you haven't discounted them, if you haven't thrown them out, if you still believe God's law is somehow enforced and not natural, you're never going to be as strong in your faith as when you know the truth. You're always going to have a weakness, just as we talked about Eve did last night. And so I want to help you tonight build this new type of trust with God. And so where we're going to start is we're going to start with God's nature. This is where I always start. And what is nature? It's something that's basic or inherent, right? It's just. And so what's God's most basic and inherent feature? What's his essence? According to the Bible, God is love, right? 1 John chapter 4, verse 8. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. So we know God is love. That is his nature. That is the essence of him, right? 1 John chapter 4, verse 8. Remember that one. That's a good one to remember. God is love. If anybody asks you, what's God like? Point to that. God is love. But what is love? The Bible tells us what that is too. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through 8. And a lot of you are going to recognize this because it gets read at weddings a lot, right? And that's a great thing to have happen, but it's unfortunate that we only come across it at weddings, right? Let's read 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through 8. And the Bible says, love is patient, love is kind and not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly, it does not seek its own, is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. Now that sounds like a God I can get behind. Matter of fact, let's go ahead and reread that, but instead of the word love, I'm going to replace that word with God. Because that's essentially what this is saying. God is patient. God is kind and is not jealous. God does not brag and is not arrogant. Does not act unbecomingly. He does not seek his own. Is not provoked. Does not take into account a wrong suffered. We're going to talk about that tomorrow. That's a good one. Does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth. Bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. God never fails. And so there's a couple of things I want to point out. I pointed out one as I was reading it. I said, does not take into account wrong suffered. That's about forgiveness. We're going to talk about forgiveness tomorrow. But if we back up just a little bit, we'll read, does not act unbecomingly, does not seek its own. So what does that mean, not to seek your own? It means not to be selfish, right? It means I'm not looking out for me. I'm looking out for everyone else. I don't seek things for me. And I'm going to make the argument tonight that is the essence of God's love. We're going to focus on that key phrase tonight. Quote from The God-Shaped Brain, one of the books I'll be quoting all week. And so this is a quote of a quote. So at the beginning of his chapters, he puts quotes to kind of frame you for the chapter. This is one of the quotes in that book. And interestingly enough, it's anonymous, so he didn't actually have a source for the quote, but it was one of the best ones I had read about love, so I wanted to share it with you all. It says, love has nothing to do with what you are expecting to get. It's what you are expecting to give, which is everything. Now, if that doesn't sum up love, I don't know what does. And if that doesn't sum up God, then maybe you don't understand him. What it's saying is love is other-centered. It's about someone else. It's about sacrifice. It's not about keeping score with someone. It's about endless giving, right? You don't ever stop, right? And what does God give? The Bible tells us. John 15:13. John chapter 15, verse 13. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down his life for his friends. Right? He's giving his life. There's more. 1 John 3:16. By this we know love, because he laid down his life for us, and we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. So in that one, he goes a little farther. He says, look, I gave everything I could give to you. I have nothing more to give you past my life. That is it. That's all I've got. And I'm expecting you to behave the same way. John 3:16, everyone knows this one. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting love. What's the theme here? Give, give, give. The last one, no, I got two more. We love him because he loved us first. That's 1 John 4:19. Right? He loved us. He gave to us so that we can love him. Right? We kind of talked about this path back, right, last night, towards the end of the night. And we're going to talk about this more. So keep this in mind. We love him because he loved us first. Right? Sort of implies a circle. Think about a boomerang. Romans 5:8. But God demonstrates his own love toward us, and that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. Right? So he gives unconditionally even, right? We know he gives, but he also gives even at our worst. And so we have to understand this about God, because it's going to drive the rest of the night. The next thing I want you to understand about love is that it's not fearful. So 1 John 4:18, we read 4:19, let's read 4:18. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves punishment, and the one who fears is not perfected in love. Right? If you've ever been in a relationship where someone doesn't quite trust you, you always sense that it's not the loving relationship it should be, right? And this is exactly what this verse is saying. And that concept applies to our relationship with God, right? Here's a great illustration from Dr. Jennings in The God-Shaped Brain. I really like this one because I have a 3-year-old. And so it was really hit home for me when I read this. He says, imagine stepping out into the street, and as you do, you see an 18-wheeler bearing down on you. What emotion do you experience? Fear. Imagine now your 3-year-old son toddles out into the same street. Now the 18-wheeler is bearing down on him. There's just enough time to run and push your child out of the way, but if you do, you will get hit. What do? You push your child out of the way. And as you see your child roll to safety in the grass, what emotion do you experience? Joy. See, in both situations, you're going to be hit by a truck, right? But in the first situation, there's only fear. In the second, your love for your child has completely vanquished that fear. All you care about is the safety of that child. There is no fear. You fearlessly step in front of a truck. And so just to kind of summarize what we've gone over so far, God's nature is love. God is love, right? We've established that. Love has many qualities. We read a whole bunch of them, but maybe the most important one is this notion of constant giving, because that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And love is giving all, right? I'm not just talking about presents. I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about what I have extra laying around. I'm talking about everything I've got, including your life. We also learn that love removes fear, right? There is no fear when you love. We have nothing to fear if we have perfect love. Doesn't that sound great? Right? Like no fear, you just walk around all day and you're not afraid of anything? Christ's life is an example of these principles, right? And since Christ is indeed God, we know that he not only is these things, he embodies them, right? It is him, right? It's not just something he demonstrates. It is actually what makes him. And so now that we've kind of established this nature of God, right? We've set it up, right? God is love, okay? And now we know what that means. And now let's go on to the next step, is let's look at how God created the universe. Because when God created the universe, he created it to work in harmony with himself. Right? Genesis chapter 1 talks about how he creates. We're not going to go over that because we don't have time. But read it. Read the words. Let it flow over you. And ask yourself this. If I'm going to create something, say you're going to have a house built, right? Are you going to create a house such that it doesn't suit you? Right? Am I going to pick canary yellow if I don't like yellow? Right? If I like cars and I want to work on my cars in my garage and I'd rather have a 2-car garage, am I going to put a carport outside if I get to choose? Right? Say I don't like stairs. I want a single-story house. Am I going to build a 2-story house? No, I'm not going to do that. Right? I'm going to build it the way I want it. Right? I'm going to build it in harmony with my tastes, you might say. This is how God created the universe. And not only this, he didn't just create it to be in harmony with himself. He actually made himself part of the creation. So it would have to be in harmony with him. He put himself into it. Not just his tastes, but himself physically in creation. Romans chapter 1, verse 20. For since the creation of the worlds, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. What is this saying? God is in nature. He is part of nature, right? You can't get away from that. And interestingly enough, I had this question when I was going through my conversion process, and Pastor McCombs used to come to my house every week, and we would do a Bible study, and a question I asked him, I said, what happens to the people that die never having heard the gospel? There's a jungle, a rainforest jungle, okay? And there's a tribe here that's never had outside contact with any other person. Now, these people have to face the same God that we do, and you have to reconcile yourself to the question of what happens because they never had the Bible that I have. They didn't have the benefit I had. Romans chapter 1, verse 20 answers that question. Because they didn't need the Bible to see God. What they needed was nature. God is built into nature. You see, these people can still choose to live in harmony with God's law, a law of love, as we'll see tonight. Or they can choose not to. And all around them, they'll see signs about what happens if you do live in a law of love and what happens if you don't. And so these people may not have gotten the benefit of the written word that we have. But they did get the benefit. They did know God. He is there. He leaves no one untouched. The Bible also says that God is actually holding things together. 1 Colossians chapter 1, verse 17. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Right? He's glue. Right? And there's this interesting phenomenon in science I'm going to geek out on you guys a little bit here. There's something called the nuclear force, right? And so if you know anything about an atom, if you remember your maybe middle school or earlier science class, they tell you that an atom has 3 types of things in it. It has electrons, which have a negative charge, have protons, which have a positive charge, has neutrons, which don't have any charge at all. They're neutral, right? And so an atom is made up of this core, which is made up of neutrons and protons. And then all these electrons kind of float around it. And the number of electrons depends on what the element is. So you get silver and gold and uranium and all these things, depending on how many electrons and protons are there, right? But when scientists discovered this, they were confused because they couldn't figure out why all these protons could pack in this little ball right in the middle of this atom. Because you see, things with the same charge don't like to be near each other. If I put an electron near another electron, it'll just shoot away. They repel, like magnets, right? And protons are the same way. So you take 2 protons, you try to put them near each other, that doesn't work. But for some reason, in the middle of this atom, they could pack all these protons in a really tight space, and they couldn't figure out why. And finally, they discovered something called the nuclear force. And it's this weird force, right? And it's unlike anything I know in nature, where if you get close enough, it's actually an attractive force, meaning it's like magnets. They suck together, right? If they're close enough. But if you pull them apart just a little bit, then it pushes them away again, right? And so this is what I think of when I read, and in him all things hold together. You can actually see God in nature. Now, a lot of scientists don't like to admit this because they've already resigned themselves to believe that God doesn't exist. So it's kind of a counter-argument to now find parallels in the Bible with what they're discovering in nature. But I don't see those things as mutually exclusive at all. And the more I look at nature, the more I learn about the world, the more I realize there has to be a God. And so we see here that God is physically part of nature, right? He is actually working in it. He didn't just create it and step outside of it. And so it would have to be in harmony with him. He's involved, right? If I'm allergic to peanuts, I'm not going to make a universe full of peanuts and go lay down in it, right? I'm not going to do that. And Dr. Jennings says, it only makes sense that when the God, who is love, created, that he constructed, built, and designed everything to operate in harmony with his own nature and character of love, because it is by him that all things hold together. It's Colossians 1:17. We just read it, right? Okay, so now we've established a few things here. I'm going to keep reviewing because this is going to get long and I don't want you guys to lose me, all right? Or I don't want to lose you, I should say. God is love. God's law of love is natural, right? We're about to talk about that. And when he created everything to be in harmony with himself, physically. You can see that in science. We're going to go through some examples, okay? But I want to talk about this thing I've been mentioning. I've thrown it out there a few times. This thing called the law of love. Okay? And what do you mostly think about when you think about law? Think about like a penal law, right? Like court systems, like lawyers and fines and jail, traffic tickets, right? Life sentences, criminal law, right? You think of those things, or at least I do. But God's law isn't like any of those types of laws. That's not what we mean when we say God's law. And this is where a lot of people get confused. You see, those laws are based on rules, right? Traffic law. If the speed limit is posted 55, I can't go faster than 55. That's a rule. If I go faster than 55, the police stop me, give me a ticket. I got to pay the ticket, right? Those are rules. This is not how God's law works. Because those penalties have to be enforced. The cop has to see you go faster than 55, and then he has to pull you over and give you the ticket. Right? And once you pay that fine, you're good. You're back in the graces of the law, right? Points added back to your license or whatever they do nowadays. I don't even know. And so this law is kind of based on imperial systems, right? Kings in the old world would lay out rules for their subjects, mostly in order to enforce some type of, what's the word I'm looking for, harmony among their subjects, right? Try to keep everybody happy, right? But a lot of times they make rules to suit themselves. If you're a king, why not, right? What's the use of being king? And then this resulted in several layers of law, because you'd have country laws and local laws. And we have the same thing now. We have federal, state, county, city laws, right? These are all written down, codified, you might say. That's the word they use. That's the lawyer speak. They're all written down very well. Lawyers get paid a lot of money to write the laws and interpret the laws. It's a legal system that we know today, right? This is not God's law. It's not anything like this. And I want to make that clear, because a lot of people get confused. See, when God designed the universe, it led to the invention of several what I call natural laws, right? Laws of nature. Think of things like gravity, right? There's something called the law of gravity. There's something called the law of thermodynamics. There's something called, particle physics. Subatomic, I can't remember the name now. But basically all that nuclear force stuff I was talking about a second ago, right? There's laws that govern those things. Now, these aren't laws that we just talked about, like penal laws, right? Because let's say, gravity governs what happens when you jump off a cliff, right? Does anybody have to pull you over and say, hey, man, you jumped off the cliff? Does anybody have to enforce the law in that case? No. You're going to hit the ground, right? It's punishment enough. Nobody's got to do anything. Nobody flies over and starts pushing you towards the ground as soon as you step off that cliff, right? Gravity takes care of it all. This is how natural laws work. They're automatic, right? There's no third party involved. And so what I want to contend this evening is that there's one overarching natural law that governs everything, right? All those laws we just mentioned, gravity, thermodynamics, nuclear force, everything that we just mentioned is governed by one overarching natural law. And what is this law? The law of love, right? So the law of love governs everything, spiritually, physically, both realms. And it's automatic, just like gravity. Dr. Jennings says here, God's law of love is the outward flow of his personhood and the constant dispersion of himself to create. We talked about this as selfless giving, right? We're going to go into that a lot more here in a second. Constant dispersion of himself to create, uphold, and sustain the universe. This giving, outward-moving, other-centered love is the design on which all creation was constructed to operate. The law of love is the principle of selfless giving, which is the foundation upon which all life is built to function. Simply put, the law of love is the law of life. Harmony with this principle brings life, health, and happiness. Disharmony naturally results in pain, suffering, and death. So if I'm in harmony with gravity, my feet are planted firmly on the ground, everything's well. As soon as I step off a cliff, I'm not in harmony with gravity, and I'm going to have pain, discomfort, and unhappiness when I hit the ground, right? This is how God's law works. It's natural. It's inbuilt. I want you guys to get that in your head because it's important. Okay? And so let's look at nature. Let's look at nature for some examples of this, just so you guys believe me. I'm not blowing smoke here, okay? I'm not trying to pull the wool over your eyes. We talked about love being constantly giving, right? And so what's a good example of constant giving? What would that look like? If you could visualize that, what would that look like? And let's pretend now that this is something you can see. I can look at a picture and see this. What would that look like? What's that picture? It's a bit of a riddle here. Here's the hint. Many people put one on their finger to symbolize their love and marriage. Right? What does that look like? It's a ring, a circle, a cycle. Right? And if you think about a cycle, it just goes around and around. That's why people use it to symbolize marriage, because that's what it's supposed to be. Endless giving. You're both loving each other endlessly. Right? You're You don't worry about loving yourself. You just worry about loving your spouse. They'll worry about loving you. So each thing feeds into the next, to the next, to the next. You can add a bunch of links on this chain, and they all give to the next. Right? That's the reason it's the symbol of marriage, right? It's the reason we put rings on our fingers. Marriage is supposed to exemplify love, right? That's what God designed it for, actually. And so now let's look at some examples in nature, okay? Let's think about how water moves throughout the earth. How does water move throughout the earth? It evaporates up into the sky, becomes clouds. The clouds drift over to some land, right? The rain falls on the land. The water runs down streams into rivers, runs from rivers into lakes and oceans, and then it happens all over again, right? What does that sound like? A cycle. It's a circle. It's nature. It's an example of God's constant giving, love. Here's another one. Human beings breathe in oxygen. Plants breathe in carbon dioxide. Right? Actually, all animals breathe in oxygen, at least all land animals. And plants breathe in carbon dioxide. So when I breathe in oxygen, something else comes out. What comes out? Carbon dioxide. Plants take in that carbon dioxide. What comes out? Oxygen. It's a cycle, right? If you take one of those things away, the other one dies. Because God designed it such that those two things have to be in sync. Well, those two things have to give to each other. It is love. It is constant giving. Electricity. Well, we talked about protons and neutrons, right? You separate them, and you watch the electron flow all the way to the other side, where the positive is, and you separate them, and then they just come back, and you separate them. That's actually the battery's job. It just separates them, and then it just comes back, and that electron just keeps flowing. The battery separates them, and it just comes back, right? And it goes in a circle like that until the battery dies. So think of all the cycles in nature now. Now that you kind of have this mindset, think of all the cycles in nature, and each one of those things are the presence of God. Predators and prey, right? You can't have one and not the other, right? If you got predators and no prey, all the predators die. They got nothing to eat. If you got prey and no predators, they overbreed. They overeat all the stuff. Now they begin taking more than they're giving. The circle's broken. The chain is defective, right? And so that's what happens when you break a cycle. There's a ripple effect. Everything else in the chain now has a price to pay. What would happen if we had no bees, right? Bees and flowers. That's another cycle, right? The bees help pollinate the flowers. Now, in recent years, there's been some concern because the honeybee populations have been dwindling, right? And so people were worried, well, if we don't have honeybees, how are our plants going to pollinate themselves? What are we going to do? A lot of people and animals would starve in that world. We can't grow food if there's no bees to help us do it. Right? You take one thing out of that chain and everything breaks. Everything dies, essentially. What would happen if there was no vegetation? We wouldn't chop down every plant and tree in the city. We'd have a hard time finding oxygen, right? And so we have to think of this cycle. We have to look for it in nature. I'm making the point here that God is in nature because His law is natural. Okay, He's not about rules. He designed things to work in a certain way, and if you break those things, there's a natural consequence that occurs. It's not like He comes down and says, now you will die. That's not what happens, right? So if you view all these natural phenomenon now, and you understand that if you take all the prey out of a predator-prey cycle, all those predators are now going to die. They have nothing to eat, right? That's easy to visualize. Nobody came in and killed all those predators. They just died because there was nothing to eat. The cycle of love was broken. Okay, next point. Love fulfills God's law. Romans 13:10. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Right? So love is fulfilling the law. Why is that? So we just talked about the law of love requires cycles to operate. Love requires constant giving. So when you put the two together, everything works. Right? You're fulfilling it. You're making it all happen. So the law of nature really is just the law of love, right? Everything that's designed is designed to operate with this law and to be in harmony with it. Matthew 5:17-18. Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until it is accomplished. This is Jesus. He came to restore a cycle. That's what he's saying. I came to fulfill. I came to put that cycle back. I came to connect one of those legs that was broken when Adam and Eve fell in the Garden of Eden. The cycle was broken. Humanity was dying. God had to come back and put that leg back in. He's not saying you don't have to love anymore. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying love is no longer required. Love is still giving. That's still part of it, right? But Christ, in the ultimate display of love, sacrificed himself for us so that he could fix this broken cycle between God and humanity. His death restored the path of love to flow between God and humanity, right? Satan broke the cycle intentionally, right? He tricked Adam and Eve, and he knew what would happen. He knew they would start to die. And from that point on, humanity has been dying. Just like we discussed, you break the cycle, everything in the cycle starts to die. But Jesus fixed it. His death fixed it. It's there. But now it's on each of us to decide if we want to be part of that cycle or not. Now we each have to decide. We have a choice. I can love, I can give, I can put myself in that cycle, and I can hope it all comes back around from the other side. And it will. Now that Jesus restored it, it works as it was intended again. But I can also choose not to. Just like I can also choose not to share my carbon dioxide with the world, right? I can say, you know what, that's my carbon dioxide, I don't want to share it with you, and then go get a Walmart bag and put it over my head, and I can hoard it all to myself. How do you think that's going to work out for me? Probably not going to last very long, am I? Right? So my selfishness cost me my life, as it is with sin, right? Because the rejection of love is sin equals death, right? It's all very natural. It makes sense now, doesn't it? Did it not make sense that a God of love would punish you and kill you? But doesn't it make perfect sense that if a cycle has been broken, now all the things along the cycle are not being fed by the thing that was supposed to feed them, and they all begin to die? Look at the alternatives. Which one makes more sense? So if we choose to take ourselves out of the cycle by putting bags over our head, or if a branch cuts itself off of a tree, if it could do such a thing, right? It dies. To be unloving is to cut yourself off from the vine of love, right? The Bible uses this language too. John 15:4. Abide in me and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit itself unless it abides in the vine. Neither can you unless you abide in me. What's he saying? I'm the vine. I got all the love. You got to be attached to me. Then you get some fruit. If you cut yourself off, I got nothing for you. I can't make the connection for you. 1 John 3:14. We know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brethren. He who does not love abides in death. It's just what I said, right? If we choose to act lovingly, if we choose to love our brothers and sisters, we have life. We're in the cycle. If we choose not to, it's just like putting a bag over your head. You're being selfish. It's not going to end well for you. The other thing we need to be careful of is not loving people actually has an impact not just on us, but on others. Right? We have to be careful of this. This is something churches have to be careful of, especially like right now. We've got new people maybe who haven't been with God for a while or maybe never have been with God. They don't know as much as you do. Right? I've been coming to church for years. I was raised in the church. We can't expect them to know what we know when they walk in the door. We can't be unloving with them. We can't give them an example of unloving in this church, because if they're already on the fence and they're trying to get right with God and they're trying to seek Him and they're trying to be loving, and all they're met with is ridicule, resentment, disdain, we're not only putting ourselves at risk, we've taken ourselves out of the cycle with that behavior. Not only that, we've taken somebody with us. And Luke 17:1-2 says, "Then he said to the disciples, 'It is impossible that no offenses should come, but woe to him through whom they do come. It would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea, than that he should offend one of these little ones.'" The little ones he's talking about are the people that are new in Christ, right? As we start to find Christ, our understanding is sort of as a child, right? He even says that. You have to become as a child. He doesn't expect you to stay as a child, but that's the starting point. And many Christians have this flaw, where when we see people living in disharmony with God's law, we often ostracize and ridicule them, shame them. They don't understand what we understand. We have to show them love. And if we don't, we've taken ourselves out of the cycle and pushed them away as well. Woe to them, Christ says. You're not doing me any favors. You're not representing my laws. The next point I want to make is that the law keeps us healthy. Would you all agree that most laws in place, even the penal laws that we have, like the traffic laws, property crime laws, are put in place to keep us healthy? Gun laws, right? Now, sometimes those laws are a little misguided and they don't do what they were intended to do. But I have no doubt that in most cases, the people behind enacting that law generally meant for it to make life better, safer. And generally, when we break these laws, things don't go right. You know, if I drive 120 miles per hour routinely, I'm just waiting to be in an accident, because now my reaction times have to be that much faster than if I was driving 65 miles an hour. And so any little thing that gets in my way, I'm not going to have time to react to. Somebody cuts me off in traffic. If I'm doing 65, I might have time to slow down. If I'm doing 120, I might be into the wall, right? A lot of guys on those crotch rockets learn this one the hard way. And say, well, let's move on. Sin destroys because it involves living outside of the universal principles on which God has based life and death. Right? This is another quote from Could It Be This Simple? Those principles are both natural and moral. Furthermore, sin exists outside of the divine law and love and liberty. We're going to talk about the law of liberty next. In fact, sin is lawlessness. God's law of love and liberty is not merely a set of arbitrary rules created by a powerful deity. Quite the contrary. His law of love and liberty emanates from his character. In fact, the principles that govern our existence and the running of the universe are an outworking of this law. Right? He's saying it's all natural. Just the argument I've been making. Right? And he goes on. He says, health comes from conformity to God's law, from living in harmony with the great principles of love and liberty. It does not result from blind conformity to a set of rules or because someone in authority or with power told you so, but because it makes sense. Right? This is why I want to break down that notion that these rules that you've been presented with, these things that you've been told, well, if you follow the 10 Commandments, you'll go to heaven. You just gotta tick all these boxes every day and you'll be okay. Don't get a speeding ticket, right? That's not how it works. It doesn't make sense. Because that would require God then to be the enforcer. He'd have to be the policeman. He doesn't want to do that. It's not his nature. In fact, obedience that springs only from sullen submission is not real obedience. It is actually violating the law of liberty and always leads to rebellion. So we're going to talk about the law of liberty next. True obedience must involve understanding and agreement. The highest level of obedience has its origin in understanding friendship. So what's this law of liberty? I've got a lot to cover. We're not even halfway, so I better speed it up. Let's use an example, okay? A woman and a man dating for a while, right? They're dating, they like each other, it's obvious they like each other. So the man decides, you know what, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to take this one to the next step. So he goes out and he buys a ring, and he's pretty confident this is going to go his way. So he gets the ring and he plans a dinner and they're out on a date. And it's a romantic moment. Maybe they're walking in a park or something, and he finally drops to his knee and he says, will you marry me? Now let's say the woman, uncharacteristically, because women generally think about these things much more than men do, but maybe she hasn't really given much thought to marrying this man yet. She liked him. She's not opposed to marrying him necessarily, but she hadn't really put a lot of thought into that. She hadn't really allowed herself to go down that path. So she's a little surprised by the question. She wasn't ready for it. She thought maybe they were a few months away from that. And so she asks for a little time to think about it. Can you give me a day or two to think about it? She doesn't want to make an impulse decision. Seems like a prudent thing to do. And so the man now becomes a little insecure and agitated. And since we live in New Mexico, you can carry a gun openly, which is fine if you want to do that. You know, this is one of those guys that thinks he's safer with a gun on his hip. So he's got his gun on his hip, and he panics because, well, she didn't say yes right away. And as we talked about last night, when you're panicking, you're not thinking clearly. So what does he do? He instinctively reaches for his gun and he says, marry me or I'll shoot you in the head. How do you think that's going to work out for him? You think she's going to be more inclined to say yes after that? Right? He just violated another one of God's natural laws. And again, this is something like gravity or, think physics, right? Things they're not mutable, or how the world is governed. It's not an enforced law. Nobody has to make this happen. But when the law of liberty, which is what was violated in this case, when the law of liberty is violated, love is destroyed, right? She is immediately turned off. She wants nothing to do with this guy because now, in her mind, even if that was just a weak moment and it would never happen again, it's completely out of character for him. She's never going to believe that, right? Think about it, ladies. Would you marry a guy who'd pulled a gun on you as he was proposing? Even if he said, I've never done that before, I don't know where that came from, right? Well, I don't know what else is going to trigger it. I think I might keep looking, right? And let's just say maybe she's afraid for her life and she says yes. Okay, yeah, I'll marry you, right? You think that's going to stick? The second she can get away, she's gonna rebel, right? She's not going to stick around for that. And so this law of liberty is important. It's kind of a subset of the law of love. It's one of the components of love, but it's an important one. Because it's one we often see in relationships, and it's one of the threads Satan likes to pull, because his accusation is that we don't have liberty. His accusation is that we're not free to choose. If we choose wrong, God's going to punish us. So you don't really have a choice. This happens a lot with children. Right? No matter how much I love my son, no matter how much I want him to be safe, I can't really make him do safe things. I can punish him when he doesn't. I can talk to him about why he should, but I can't make him because I'm not controlling his arms and legs. I can't control his mind. And it's only going to get worse as he gets older. That's why we don't spank our teenage children. Has anybody ever tried that? Doesn't work out too well, right? They laugh. At some point, my child has to begin understanding why I'm asking him not to do something. He has to accept and choose to live in accordance with whatever I've asked him to do. It's got to come from him, right? But if he continues to choose against my advice, if he continues to ignore me, he'll have to live with the consequences. And I have no recourse. What could I do? Spank him until he's 30? Put a gun to his head and threaten him? I can't do those things, right? They would only serve to widen that gap between us. And so this is how God has to deal with us. You cannot force people to know love. It actually does the exact opposite. And if somebody chooses not to act lovingly, continually, as Satan did, the only thing you can do is leave them to their choice. That's all. That's the only thing you can do. Think through it, right? Well, I could chain them to the bed. Nope. Violates the law of liberty. Well, I could threaten them. Nope. Violates the law of liberty. Right? Any other thing you do actually makes the problem worse. All you can do is leave them to their own actions and hope they see the truth. Okay, the next piece I want to go through, I want to talk about God's law in written form. Because I've been talking about God's law naturally, but we know there's a written form of the law in the Bible, right? Usually we think of the Ten Commandments. There's other parts of the Bible that are written. The Jews had something called ceremonial laws or rabbinic laws, right? There's a lot of laws written in the Bible. And basically all these laws are always given as a set of rules. Okay? And so when we compare this to physical laws like gravity and thermodynamics and all the things I've been mentioning tonight, right? What if I described gravity like the Ten Commandments describe God's law of nature, of love? Thou shalt not jump off high places or something, right? Now, this doesn't really embody all of gravity, but it keeps you safe, right? And who would I give this type of law to? Why don't I do this to everybody? Who would I tell this to? Probably like a child, right? I tell my son all the time, son, don't jump from there, please. You're going to hurt yourself, right? But my son understands gravity a lot better than he understands the law of love because, well, he's been learning gravity since he was 6 months old, right? My younger son is right in that phase. He's learning to sit up, right? But he's learning that if he gets too far to one side or the other, what's going to happen? It's going to keel over. And he'll learn gravity is a much harsher mistress when he tries to learn how to walk, right? Gravity's not kind always. But let's go back to this law. Thou shalt not jump off of high places. Right? We don't learn gravity this way because we're in gravity, right? I mean, from the time we're born, we understand it. We have to deal with it. We have to interact with it, right? But because of Adam and Eve's fall now, it's not naturally around us, this law of love, like gravity is. We have to search for it a little more. We don't understand it intuitively like we do gravity. And let's look at how God gave the Ten Commandments. Did he give them to Adam and Eve? He didn't give them to Adam and Eve. Why is that? Because they understood the law of love naturally, intuitively, the same way you and I understand gravity. Because when it was created, that's how it was meant to be. It was meant to be just one of the natural things that occurs in the world. Sin broke that. Right? And the other thing to note about when the Ten Commandments, is when they were given. See, they were given as we just stated, not to Adam and Eve at creation. They were given to the Jews when? As they exited Egypt. Right? And what were they doing in Egypt? They were slaves. Right? And when you're a slave, how do you view the world? Hey, slave, go do this. Hey, slave, don't do that. Hey, slave, if you don't do this, you're going to get the whip. All day, every day, generation after generation, it is threats, it is coercion, it is black and white, do this, don't do that. And so logic had been literally beaten out of these people. They understood the world as children, basically. And so God, knowing that he needed to reintroduce this law of love to them, had to introduce it in such a way that it made sense to children. This is why the Ten Commandments read like a list of rules for children. You'll see similar rules in nurseries all the time. Keep your hands to yourself. Wash your hands. Flush the toilet, right? This sounds a lot like the Ten Commandments. And so God gave them these 10 rules that are essentially a description of his law meant for children. Now, that doesn't make them unusable, but God never intended for them to keep viewing his law in that frame. This was a starter package. Use this as a guide, but grow. Just like I have rules for my son at 3, I will not describe those rules the same way when he is 12. Right? What's a good example? Don't play in the street, right? When he's 3, I say, see that line? Past it is the street. Cars come in the street. They're not going to see you. They're going to hit you. Right? When he's 12, he understands that concept. So what do I say? Hey, watch out for cars, huh? Right? You're going to the park? Be careful. Right? I don't describe it the same way when he's older. And so this is what God had to do to Israel. He had to give them rules like children because they had been so subjected to that type of mentality for so long that they couldn't understand anything else. Dr. Jennings says, God's law of love and liberty is not merely a set of arbitrary rules created by a powerful deity. Quite the contrary, his law of love and liberty emanates from his character. We've read this one, right? I just want to read it again right here. In fact, the principles that govern our existence and the running of the universe are an outworking of his law, right? Again, we need to keep moving. We need to understand it at this level. Jesus taught this, right? Jesus actually taught the law at the next level. He said, look, guys, we've got to do something about this. You guys got all these laws. You got 300 and something laws. It's not doing any good. Right? And so somebody asks him, hey, teacher, what's the greatest commandment? Matthew 22, 36 through 40. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law, right? He's expecting him to list one of the 10 commandments. And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. These 2 commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. Right? He's saying, look, you got to stop thinking like that, man. You're done with that. Move on. Let me tell you what it's really about. It's about love. Love God. Love your fellow man. If you do that, the 10 commandments, you don't need them. You're going to follow all those things naturally. Jesus didn't mention a 10 commandment. These guys would have debated which of the 10 commandments are greatest for years. But the 10 commandments are just a distillation of God's natural law, which is love. This is what Jesus is trying to get at here. He finally just outright says it. John 13, 34 and 35. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. As I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. He even tells us how to find others. Because Christ started to realize that the Jews could not see the forest through the trees. They couldn't see the forest of love because they were looking at all the trees that were the commandments. They wanted you to pick out a tree. He was trying to get them to look at the forest. And how did God intend for us to use the law? These 10 commandments, what were their real purpose, right? Was it to admonish people and say, nope, you did it wrong, you did it right, okay, here's your point. Let me take a point away from you. No, that's a penal system, right? That's not what he intended. Dr. Jennings says, the 10 Commandment portion of the law is a special distillation of the great cosmic law of love and liberty, written especially for those of us here on this planet. Did the angels in heaven require a law to honor their mother and father? They didn't have a mother and father. They're created. Or instruct them not to commit adultery? They don't marry. No. But they did need to operate by the law of love and liberty as discussed earlier in this book. The 10 Commandments are a further extrapolation of this law. So God not only gave them a law, but he gave them very specific law for human beings, right? And so we can see that God was setting them up with the starter kit. They were never supposed to use it forever. They were supposed to grow. And we said that it didn't come till after the fall of Adam. There was no need of it before. Another example I like, Dr. Jennings being a doctor, he likes to use medical examples. He says the written law, the 10 Commandments, is like an MRI of the soul. It reveals the defects, right? An MRI is that big old tube. It looks like a coffin, and they slide you in there. And they're basically taking pictures of everything, right? They can see everything inside of you, right? Doctors, those things are expensive, so they don't really write prescriptions for them very often. But doctors can tell everything that's wrong with you when you get an MRI, right? And so this is what his example is look, the 10 Commandments aren't meant to say do this, don't do that. It's meant as an internal evaluation device. Search yourself, right? Don't hold up the mirror to everybody else. Look at the mirror yourself. It was never intended to persecute others. And so we must grow in our understanding, right? We're called to be mature Christians. This is another quote from Dr. Jennings. To develop the ability to discern the right from the wrong. But all too often we remain as little babes concerned about breaking the rules or worried about hurting our Father. When will we actually grow up and understand our Father? When will we enter into unity, harmony, and friendship with Him? And when will we cooperate with Him for the restoration of His image within the writing of His law and methods on our hearts and minds, right? We can't just view the law as do this, don't do that. We have to grow. We have to mature. What happens if we don't? Let's say I set a rule for my son. I say don't play in the street. Say we don't live on a busy street. And every time I go outside, I catch him playing in the street, and he never learns his lesson. Always playing in the street. And he looks at me and says, Dad, what's the big deal? Nothing bad happens when I play in the street. Why are you so worried about it? Right? But he doesn't understand traffic because he's never seen a car go by. And let's say he grows up to be a grown man and he's never seen anything bad happen when he plays in the street. And then he has children. Do you think he's going to let his children play in the street? Well, if he doesn't understand the rule, if he doesn't understand why I told him not to play in the street, he might. He might say, my dad always had this silly rule that I couldn't play in the street, and I never got it. You know what? You guys go have fun. I'm not going to be like my dad. I'm not going to be that mean, controlling dad that I had. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be the cool dad, right? Except the problem is my son bought a house on a busy street. He didn't live in the country. And very soon he realizes why Dad told him not to play in the street. as he scoops his child off the pavement. It's a protection, right? Just because he never got hit by a car doesn't change why I set the rule in the first place. I set the rule to keep him safe. Just because he coincidentally never had anything to be kept safe from in that case doesn't mean he never would have something to be kept safe from. Doesn't mean there's no danger. It just meant there was less danger where he was. Little did he know, I set up traffic barriers on both sides of the block. See, he never knew that, so that's why he was safe, right? This is what God does, right? He keeps us safe in a situation that we're not supposed to be in. And then at the end of it, we think, see, nothing bad happened, right? Well, yeah. Thank God, literally. It's easy to get confused, right? And what's the root of this confusion between me and my son, right? His lack of understanding about the danger and the fact that he may be a little suspicious of my motives. He's like, my dad's just being a mean guy, right? He doesn't really care about me. But the thing is, at some point, I have to trust that he understands that rule. When he's a 30-year-old man, I cannot go to his house and spank him in front of his wife for playing in the street. I can't do that, right? And how do I do that? How do I try to get that instilled in him when he's a child? When he's a child, he goes in the street, and what do? He's 3 years old, and I've done this before. He walks out in the street, he's not paying attention. I grab his arm. Don't you ever do that again. Did I do that because I was mean? Because I'm a bad father? Or did I do that because that choice got the message across, and it was a lot better than the alternative, which was waiting for him to get hit by a car? Because if I let the law naturally take its course, which is, hey, I'm just going to let him play in the street until he learns his lesson. How's he going to learn his lesson? By getting hit by a car. And there may not be another lesson to learn after that, right? And so I'm going to impose a consequence here that is a lesser consequence than what he would have naturally incurred. Is it to protect him? Does it keep him safe? God has to do this too sometimes. The Israelites, if you look at the things they went through in the desert, look at the behavior they had in the desert. God unleashes poisonous snakes, right? Getting bit by a snake is nothing. Your eternal soul is at stake. Wake up, right? He's trying to keep his children safe until such time that they understand his rules. This is how people get confused about the difference between God in the Old Testament and God in the New Testament. Because they don't understand that the Israelites didn't see the world the way they were supposed to. They didn't understand the rules the way they were supposed to. God was protecting them until such time that understanding came. Problem is they got stuck. And we'll discuss punishment more on another night. So real quick, because we're running out of time. I'm basically out of time, and I still got stuff to cover. I want to review real quick. I've been blabbing on a lot about rules and laws and consequences, right? And you may be confused now, so let's just go over this real quick. So God is love, right? That's where we started. God created all things to be in harmony with himself and his loving nature. Okay? Consequence of these two things is that the universe is governed by the law of love. Law of love is a natural law, like gravity. It's not imposed. Nobody comes and enforces it. There's no police officer. There's no jail. It's not like traffic tickets, spankings, or groundings. It's not like any of that stuff. God's rules, the Ten Commandments, are a distillation of the law, specific to mankind, right? And we're usually introduced to Christ through these rules, right? But if we fail to progress our understanding of these rules, and we never come to understand the law behind them, we're going to misunderstand God. A lot of people fall victim to this. And this has implications on our faith, right? It has implications on our ability to spread the gospel, on our ability to have relationships, on our ability to love, right? Because if all we're doing is checking off boxes, we're not really loving. And let's look at what Satan's description of God is, right? Because he says God is a selfish dictator. He picks rules that benefit himself. He doesn't care about us or our well-being. He only cares about himself, and if it suits him better, he'll hurt us or kill us. He tells Eve, you can eat that fruit, it won't hurt you. God just told you that because he doesn't want you to be like him. He doesn't want any rivals. Satan maintains God makes things up for the purpose of serving his own interests. Okay, we're getting down to the end. This is the last thing. It's not short, but it's the last thing I promise, okay? And I'm going to go fast. We now know God's law is natural. It's not arbitrary rules. Beating that all night. We know that the rules are a reflection of God's law. And the only way the rules can change, the Ten Commandments, is if the natural law changes, right? I can't change gravity. I can't change the constant of gravity. I can't do it. I'm a human being. I don't have that power. I couldn't, any more than I could declare that I could fly, walk up to the top of this building, and then jump off, right? That's not going to work, right? Does everybody understand that? I can't just say something and then it be when it's a natural law. Okay? Well, why does this matter? Well, because there are people in this world that are seeking to change God's law, and it can't be done. Right? Because if you understand it to be a natural law, you will understand that doesn't make any sense. Daniel 7:25. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. Daniel says somebody's going to come in here and try to change God's law. I won't be able to talk about that this week, unfortunately. It's a good study. Talk to one of the elders or pastor if it's something you're interested in. They could probably do a lot better job than I could at this point because I'm not as versed on it as I'd like to be. But it's an interesting study. Somebody's trying to change the law. I'm going to talk a little bit about it right now, but there's a whole lot more. Right? And the interesting part is who. Right? You know, in the SDA church, we get hung up on this issue. We know the Ten Commandments are indeed changed. This is a non-refuted fact, right? The Ten Commandments have been changed. Those who changed it freely admit it. Not only that, they claim the authority to be able to do so, right? God's law was changed. But see, a lot of us get wrapped around the axle on this issue that something was changed in the Ten Commandments, and we miss the bigger issue. You see, we're talking about what changed, and the bigger issue is that somebody thought that they could be changed in the first place. Because this implies then that they thought these were just a set of rules. These were just a list of things to do and don't, and I can tweak them a little bit if I need to. They didn't view it as a reflection of God's natural law. They didn't view it as a description of gravity. They viewed it as, hey, do this, don't do that, kneel here, go to church on that day. That's all they thought it was. And they said, if we tweak this one a little bit, we could probably get more people in church. Okay, let's do that then. You see, what this really comes down to is this is evidence that the church at that time did not view God's law as natural and immutable, like gravity, like thermodynamics, like nuclear physics. Whoever that person was had lost sight of the fact that God's law is built into nature. It cannot be changed by human beings. I cannot change God's law any more than I can hope to change gravity. I hope I'm beating that into you enough tonight because it's really important to understand it. Because what's at stake here? See, many Christians have been fooled into believing that God's law is just a set of rules. Many people in the world in general have been fooled on this issue. We've forgotten that God's law is natural. It's not taught any longer. We're susceptible, just like Eve was. We don't have the full truth. And the Bible does teach this. And the early church did teach this. This was an intentional move by Satan. He used misdirection. What he did was he went And this is a war tactic. You cause an explosion over here, but really the attack's going to come from over here. So the explosion happens over here. The enemy diverts all their attention over here. You sneak in the back door. You got him. This is exactly what he did. He created a diversion. He changed the 10 Commandments and openly admitted it. He said, look, I'm just going to tweak these things. It's no big deal. He knew people would argue about that. He knew they would be confused about that. But what he didn't tell you was that the real change was he was changing a view of something natural built into nature into something that was just a set of rules, a list to go by. And that's all the evidence I need to state that Christianity itself has been infected with lies, as I've been maintaining all week. The original lie that Satan told in heaven, that God is arbitrary, that he picks these rules out of a hat, whatever suits him, has made it from heaven to earth, lasted millennia, and has infected the church today as we know it. Many Christians believe this. It's frightening. And the thing is, we're all part of this lie, because at the time this happened, at the time in history when this happened, there was one Christian church. Now there's some thousands of denominations of Christianity, but there was one at this time, and we all bit into it. We all got duped. Fortunately, some figured it out. And so I hope you see where this is going, right? Satan has basically taken something that is natural, inbuilt, unchangeable, mutable, and he's fooled us into thinking that it's nothing more than a couple of do's and don'ts. I'm going to read you a quote here. Satan, the greatest deceiver in the universe, uses this strategy to near perfection. And God prophesied through Daniel that the evil one would speak against God and seek to change his law, referencing Daniel 7:25. For years I, like many other Christians, was bamboozled into believing I knew the devil's lie about God's law. But recently I discovered I had only identified his misdirection. Some Christians have argued the change in God's law, prophesied by Daniel, occurred when the 10 Commandments law was changed. For more than 500 years, these changes have been a point of contention between various Christian groups. This is a diversion. Satan, master of misdirection, was this. Satan's master misdirection was what this open change to the Decalogue was. Make an overt, admitted, and endorsed change in the law, everyone focusing on this obvious modification, arguing for or against it, and then infect their minds with the real change they never even notice. Diabolically brilliant. I got a couple of more quotes here and I'll end it. Jesus came so that we might have life and have it more abundantly here and now, as we anticipate the day that the mortal life puts on immortality. The abundant life is the life of love, which only occurs when we replace the twisted versions of God with truth, enabling God's love to flow through us and others. Right? This is the bottom line tonight. And I want to leave you with this last thought. What would be the safest society? This is another quote from Dr. Jennings, these last two I read. One filled with many prisons, guards, and police at every corner? Or a society filled with people who love others more than themselves and would rather die than hurt another? So let's think about this. We live in a society not like the first one, right? We have prisons, we have guards, we have policemen. And most of us think we're pretty safe, right? I mean, I'd say I'm pretty safe walking around most of the day. But I'm not completely safe. But how safe would you feel if you knew no one in this world would ever hurt you? That's what God wanted. He didn't want jails, prisons, guards, policemen. He didn't need all that. That's a stopgap. We've had to create that to keep people safe. Don't be fooled, right? God designed the world such that everyone loved each other. You don't need enforcers. And so many of us have accepted Satan's premise that God's law is just a set of rules. And some of us feel like that's okay and we can get away with that and we'll probably still be okay, because as long as I stay in between those lines that those 10 statements lay out, I'll be fine. God will find me worthy at the end. Others have looked at that system and said, you know what, this doesn't make any sense. I reject it. I'm not going to buy into that. They claim to be atheist or any number of other things. But either way, you're in trouble. Either way, you're in trouble, because just like Eve, you don't have everything you need to answer the question. Because if I just reject God and say, you know what, that God, that's not the one, and I stop looking, if I stop looking, I'm no better than if I had just accepted the false God. I still don't have God. And if I do accept God, but I have some misinformation about him, and I don't seek to get rid of that misinformation, now Satan can conquer me, just like he conquered Eve. Because remember, the battle is for your mind. And if your mind has already been given to him, it's done. So I'm going to challenge you tonight to see God's law for what it is. We're going to hand out some cards for you, and I want you to really think about what we've said. I want you to really think about whether or not you believe God's law is natural, loving, protective, that it's not punishing, coercive, and arbitrary. I want you to ask yourself if now that you know that love vanquishes fear, if you can accept that love and free from fear, now you can dedicate yourself to God. You don't have to be afraid anymore. Because if we don't find this truth, the battle's lost. If it's not in here, if it hasn't yet destroyed those fortresses that hold thoughts against God, then Satan's already conquered the territory of your mind. And so meditate on that, please, tonight. Really think about it before you fill out this card. Mark whichever box that you think matches you. Do you just need prayer? Right? Are you just having a hard time? You believe all this stuff? You were on board already? Maybe you left the church. You had some struggles. Maybe you're starting to realize you misinterpreted some things. You want to come back. Maybe you even want to take it further than that. Maybe you want to rebaptize yourself. Maybe you're looking at your life and you're saying, I don't have the strength that I think I should have. Why is that? I need to take a step. I need to make a bold statement. And finally, some of you out there maybe have never taken that step. And I hope that the truth has put enough in you tonight and this whole week for you to at least consider taking that step. Because as we talked about, love does vanquish fear. If you're sitting there right now and you're thinking, I don't know if I can do this. I'm afraid to stand up. I'm afraid to raise my hand. I'm afraid to mark that box because I don't know what it's going to mean for my life. I can tell you I understand exactly where you're coming from. I used to sit right in that pew, and every time I heard that call, I would sit there frozen, thinking in the back of my mind that I should get up. I knew I should get up, but I never did it. And it's because I didn't understand what I understand now. I didn't understand that God was love. I thought what I was going to be signing up for was a life of rule following, guilt, and punishment. And realizing now that that's not how it works. I hope some of you can have the courage to take that step, to make that move for God.